Thank you so much, Simon, and thanks to Europol and the Basel Institute for giving UNODC the opportunity to host this conference this year. And I'm gladly joined today by Tarana Baghirova, which is the Financial Investigations Program Lead for the Organizational Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Scott Johnston, Director of Business Development for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Chainalysis. Adedeji Owonibi, Senior Partner, Virtual Asset Regulatory Compliance and Investigations for A&D Forensics. And Police Major General Ronnie Cariaga, which is the Director of the Anti-Cybercrime Group of the Philippines. National Police, so quite a good panel here, diverse profiles for addressing the issue of the use of cryptocurrencies by criminal organizations who are perpetrating serious forms of crimes, including human trafficking, smuggling of migrants, and drug trafficking. From the UNODC perspective, I have to say that several decades have passed by since the adoption of relevant UN conventions that are addressing transnational organized crime, drugs trafficking, but also human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. And it was mentioned by John Brandolino this morning that we foresee the adoption of a new UN convention on cybercrime, which will give the opportunity to member states to develop new legislations and approaches also for those forms of criminal organizations that are adopting the use of cryptocurrencies as well. There are several takeaways from the previous discussions and panelists and speakers, starting from Arianna and Emma, which explained very well the various techniques which are available for criminals for obfuscating the use of cryptocurrencies and movement of value between different jurisdictions and using the system as an underground financial channel, which was mentioned also later on by other speakers. I really appreciate the mentioning from Paul about the flexibility of criminal organizations for moving from the classic use of money laundering techniques through the banking system and financial institutions nowadays through the use of crypto exchanges and use of cryptocurrencies and virtual assets in general. And also for the discussions that were covered by Alison and Chandana, which I have to thank also for mentioning the UNODC research and reports, specifically focus on what's happening in Southeast Asia at the moment and East Asia, but which is relevant at global level because we see organized criminal groups operating from that region, which are targeting victims all over the world. And we heard from them how there is a significant convergence between cyber criminals who have been focusing in the past for proliferation financing for some other reasons, but they developed systems which became available for junkets who were providing services to various casinos, land-based casinos, but also online and gambling entertainment platforms, and how they are now becoming again an underground financial channel or underground banking system, which is facilitating the laundering and movement of funds or value for criminal organizations. Now, Nick mentioned also fake job offers, which are also exploited by these criminal organizations. We see human trafficking for forced criminality starting from fake job offers in Southeast Asia, and the situation is becoming very, very serious. These criminal organizations are really violent and dangerous, and we should bear in mind that. Artificial intelligence is obviously providing some opportunities on both sides, but we see it at the moment mainly exploited by criminals, a little bit less by government agencies, law enforcement agencies. We do obviously support at global level in the international community on the development of new approaches against these forms of crimes. It was mentioned by Chandana before, the Financial Action Task Force work on this space. There is a work being done by FATF at the moment, which responds to the question coming from Chandana. There is with the risk trends and method groups of FATF, there is a work ongoing on online gambling and gaming platforms. So we are supporting also that work that we hope will develop in further research and policy and major attention to these forms of criminality, especially when it is connected to the use of cryptocurrencies. Having said that, having given a little bit of explanation of the trends that we see at UNODC, of the situation as well, I will pass now the floor to our speakers and panelists. I will go in order, as it was mentioned in the agenda. And we are going to focus on two major topics. And the first one will be to have a discussion on what are some of the significant challenges and opportunities which are available for investigating or preventing the use of cryptocurrencies by criminal organizations for these serious forms of crimes. I would like to start with Tarana, and I will give 5 minutes each for each of the topics that we're going to discuss. And if you want to add a little bit more on your profile in a short way, but please, what is your opinion or approach on this situation?
Thank you, Fabrizio. So I'm Tarana Baghirova. I work for the Office of the OSCE Special Representative for Combating Human Trafficking. Our secretariat is in Vienna, so we are here, also based, and we represent 57 participating states, which is mostly the whole of Europe, United States, Canada, but also Central Asia, Caucasus, where I come from, and including Mongolia, which is our recent participating state. So I lead the financial investigations into human trafficking. So our mandate is purely on combating human trafficking in all its manifestations and forms. We develop a specific tools for financial services, and our new focus is on cryptos this year. So just to come for your questions, Fabrizio. So there are indeed some challenges, and I'd like to cluster it into two buckets, if I may say. So the first one I will actually look at more broadly. There's a huge problem with investigating human trafficking cases, and related whether or not it's crypto or not, and particularly looking at the financial flows as it relates to human trafficking related crimes. So why it's a problem? First of all, as we say, it's a crime where there is a human in the middle, there is a victim in the middle, and usually for criminal justice practitioners, it's very essential that they actually have victim testimonies, which is very difficult in cases when the victim is so much traumatized with sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, when they're forced into crimes. So to get in any evidences from victim becomes very difficult. And at some point, if the victim is not assisted enough, the victim depart. Most of the times there are migrants in the countries. And then it's just the criminal justice then they trail off from the investigations. And at some point, the perpetrators do not reach the criminal liability. The second, the biggest chunk of the problems also comes in terms of the digitalization of the crime. So as before, we were looking at the sexual exploitation when we're talking about trafficking, but now it has moved a lot to online landscape. So there is a lots of online exploitation, recruitment, control of victims. And that also creates a lot of technical capabilities for the law enforcement in terms of how they can actually identify, how they can use evidences that can actually corroborate from the digital evidences, and whether or not the judges will actually accept those digital evidences in the courtrooms. So, and as we come closer to the discussions of this today's one, which relates to financial flows. So, which is another layer of the problem, because when we're talking about financial flows, because then the major components here are the financial intermediaries, my financial sector. So there is a lot of focus now in the NYC, the Europol's also project on FIP. There are lots of also on the national side. But from the national side, there are more or less, there's also going on the operationalized, but there's still a lot to do. There's still a lot to do in terms of how we share the information, both the strategic and tactical, between the public and private, but also between the private to private. So as we come to the major cause of the cryptos related offenses, so we're now doing the research on how the cryptos are being used for trafficking cases. And we see two major patterns of exploitation where the cryptos are prevalent. And these are, the first one is child sexual abuse materials and child sexual abuse. So this is one of the horrific forms of exploitation that children are facing now. And if previously there were a lot of issues around child sexual abuse materials being from the global south towards, we were talking about the Philippines, for example, But now there's a lot of problems now with when the live streaming, child sexual abuse materials are being used, and that's actually in Western Europe. So we've been doing, as I did the country assessments a few years ago, and we've done around 20 country assessments, particularly looking at the Western Europe, we could see how the children are actually being exposed to online sexual abuse. And in many cases, the cryptos are actually being used to pay for those services in terms of when they're commercialized. So in our research, we could see that how the Bitcoin in particular is being used. Although it's vastly used in many cases, like the cases that's done by the United States, the Welcome to Video, Darknet scandals. But there's also other privacy coins like Monero has been used a lot because of to anonymize the illicit profits that is gained through that. So just to say that there is a data that already gives us a sharp truth about how it's been used, that the Internet Watch Foundation reported that out of the web pages that they actually checked through, they could see that the cryptocurrencies were the mostly used payment types to purchase the child sexual abuse materials. The second biggest form of payment was credit cards, and the third one was payment services. So these three types of obviously being used, and cryptos are likely to be used even more, as there is an immense increase in the use of child sexual abuse materials, and the number of child sexual offenders have increased a lot across the OSCE.
Thank you so much, Tarana, and that's very interesting explanation and understanding on how the situation is developing. And Scott from Chainalysis, we see that several firms, which are also represented here, are providing great service for government agencies and law enforcement investigations in this space. What is your point of view on these matters?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Fabrizio, for allowing me to participate here today, and to my colleagues and partners there at Europol. As a bit of a background, I'm lucky enough that I've dealt on both sides of the equation, both public sector and private sector, having spent 18 years in the Metropolitan Police in serious organised crime. I guess the biggest challenge, and I guess the biggest elephant in the room, so to speak, is this isn't a new phenomenon with the association of cryptocurrency being utilised by organised crime groups. This isn't new. Obviously, there's more and more reporting coming to the fore now, and there's more identification of that problem. I think what I can highlight the issues is back in 2018, the last operation investigation I ran in the Metropolitan Police was looking at a transnational drug trafficking organisation, which was great. It was a very interesting operation, great investigation. Drugs were seized, finance was seized, cash was seized. What we didn't realise and what we didn't give actual attention to was the presence of cryptocurrency being involved or utilised by those protagonists, both on the drug supply, but also probably more associated with the onward money laundering of the proceeds generated. If we had taken the opportunity and thought as part of that of our investigation strategy, we had uncovered a far wider global network at play. And this was back in 2018, so the problem is only magnified. The challenges are, and maybe us here at Chainalysis and other areas of this type of business, we're guilty of associating cryptocurrency with cybercrime. Cybercrime isn't cryptocurrency, and vice versa. So I think what we have to have an understanding is, what is the definition of organised crime, and how is cryptocurrency being utilised in a very broad spectrum? For myself, looking at it intrinsically and subjectively, there's three principal reasons or uses of cryptocurrency to support an organised crime group. Number one, as we've already heard, is the payment. Either they themselves were paying for wider infrastructure to help their criminal enterprise continue. They themselves are seeking payment in cryptocurrency. And the stuff there identified by a colleague at the far of the panel, Welcome to Video, CSAM sites, that's a prime example where it's being utilised as a payment for an illicit service. Extrapolate that out, intellectual property crime, online digital piracy, counterfeit goods, pharmaceuticals. We're now seeing a huge drive into that payment process being provided by cryptocurrency. Why? Is it the mistaken belief that organised crime groups believe that cryptocurrency is still anonymous? Or yes, it is anonymous, but semi-anonymous or due anonymous? Or are there other reasons behind? We don't know the reasons why there's been a transition. Maybe it's due to the good work conducted by public-private partnerships ongoing in this room here today, which has now forced those criminal enterprises to utilize cryptocurrency as their primary payment mechanism. We've seen it through kind of CSAM sites, the payment for drugs, darknet market goods, firearms, whatever it is, you can now look to pay in cryptocurrency. The second one, probably the most relevant to this room today, is the onward money laundering, informal value transfer system, facilitating the movement of funds from A to B as quickly as possible under the noses of government regulators.
Do you maybe have time to take one of our
easy.
questions?
A prime example of why cryptocurrency now fills that void. I could talk from my time in the UK, where we saw cash-based money laundering facilitated through MSBs. We clamped down on that, had some great success, operational activity. Then we saw the currying physical amounts of cash, criminally obtained cash, out of the country, in concealments in vehicles, in lorries and freights going out. We've identified that as a threat and a risk. We've clamped down on that. The next thing we had was the iteration of money actually being flown out of the country. So £1 million a day being flown through the traditional system out into other jurisdictions. Clamp down on that. So what else is left to fill that void? Well, naturally, cryptocurrency. We look at a definition of blockchain. We look at a definition of informal value transfer system. Very, very close similarities. Of course, from each. Stands to reason cryptocurrency fills that gap. This is now being driven probably by those high-end money laundering entities who are telling the organised crime groups you need to be cryptocurrency to avoid detection. Why?
When we talk about money laundering,
wider law enforcement, government agencies, outside of those cybercrime experts are not used to dealing with cryptocurrency. Everything, usually, and I can speak from my own background and through the role I play in Chainalysis and going around the world, if you look, and answer openly and honestly, if you go to an agency, law enforcement, the responsibility for cryptocurrency will lie in cybercrime. Traditionally, historically, they have the expertise. What I would say for the serious organised crime aspect, those facilitators of the onward money laundering, they're not complex investigations. So that's another kind of issue a challenge we're facing, is upskilling those other wider investigators, those financial analysts, to consider this as part of an investigation strategy. And the third use, why they're using cryptocurrency, is probably a realization of asset or to hide hidden assets. I think we've talked about NFTs already here today, potentially looking to use criminally derived funds to set up mining pools with cash to generate then freshly minted new coins, to be able to facilitate that onward money laundering. So if we look at it, the criminal use of cryptocurrency in furtherance of organised crime is no different to how cash or money is actually used. It's just a modern indication of that. So what we need to do is look intrinsically, internally, where our kind of threats and our risks are as an organisation to actually mitigate against that. And that's an understanding. We can help with that. That's going to have people in the room.
This criminal information hub, we can link informations.
Thanks so much, Scott. One of the topics that you mentioned, like, the fact that cryptocurrencies were historically looked at as a cybercrime issue. This was mentioned also last year in this conference. I was lucky enough to participate at the one at Europol. It was mentioned as well, we shouldn't look just at cryptocurrencies as a cybercrime problem, but it's actually value moving, which is used by criminals who are moving from the classic use of big cash or cash controllers, who now are actually relying also on stable coins mainly for laundering proceeds associated with criminal organizations and also drug trafficking. Thank you so much. Deji, from A&D Forensics, what is your experience or expertise on these challenges and opportunities?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. So for Africa, I want to say we've been able to see
takeaways, and I believe strongly in the word brevity. My first takeaway is that from the discussions today, it's safe to say that investing in preventing and combating the misuse of the crypto ecosystem for financial crime is vital to safeguard both national and international security. My second takeaway is that we need to demystify crypto. 20 years ago, when I still had hair, financial investigation wasn't cool. We moved forward, and now everyone's doing it. It's pretty mainstream. I think now we find ourselves in a similar situation with crypto. It's not a mainstream function of most of our colleagues in law enforcement, still seen as something that's very scientific and needs specialist skills. I think several of our speakers have actually said it's no different from how we normally investigate things. It's just applying a different prerogative. I think that's a really important thing we need to take on board. And I think, in fact, Aidan said if you can recover vehicles, you can recover crypto. There's one thing to take away for me.
That's it.
educated and very tech savvy.
We have seen
For
examples of how
example,
law
we have
enforcement
our
agencies
regional
are
offices
working
in Nairobi,
collaboratively
Kenya. We also operate
collaboratively
out of West
with
Africa, for
crypto
example.
asset
I'm
service
originally
providers,
from
blockchain
Nigeria,
analysis firms, and specialist
that
asset
will explain to
recovery
you
and management agencies
a
to
lot
detect,
of
trace,
things we see.
seize,
Most
and
of the
recover
biggest challenge, in my
illicit
view,
crypto assets.
is actually
Quite simply,
the
as law enforcement, we
investigative law
cannot do this
enforcement
alone.
officers not even understanding,
Public-private partnerships
how
and
to go about
public-public
this
private
fortune. So you have chunk and
public-public
tons of these
partnerships are
criminalities on their
pivotal
desk,
to what we do, and not just in
and
the
then
sphere of crypto,
we can
but
just
across the
track
spectrum.
to some
We look
extent
at
what we can from
what
the private sector, and
banking
there's
sector
a
is called
limit
FISP,
to
financial
what we can do. Of
intelligence
course,
service
we'll be
partnerships,
working,
or
I think, I'm
GIMLET.
still Scott
There's
for the
various
first
different
time,
names
and
for it, but what we are seeing very clearly is collaborative partnerships
back in
have far more
2019,
traction than trying to do it alone.
Actually,
And I think
even
that's
terror
really important
financing
message to
and
take away.
kidnapping out of Nigeria using Bitcoin.
I want to say that
And when we
we've
looked
seen
at
how
it together, I was
policymakers
at that
and
time in
lawmakers
France, and we
are
looked at it
strengthening
jointly, and we
regulations and making the
discovered it
crypto
very complex.
ecosystems
So again,
subject to the same
complexity
controls and
of the
supervision
transactions,
as the
like
more
we saw,
traditional financial
in the
institutions
presentation
in
by,
some places.
Terem and of
Many,
course,
I think we're
Adedeji,
quite
you can
heavily
see
top
it's
heavy
not
with Europe
the
here,
main feed for
and
people
with
that are not tech savvy
western
to
part of
start
the
with.
globe.
And that,
Certainly in our part of
again,
Africa,
is
we
a
don't
big
always
challenge
see
that we
the
see.
same degree
And
of
so
regulation
because the
and
criminal elements
legislation.
now notice that,
Not long
okay,
ago,
it
I was
looks
with the
like there's
governor of a
an
central
arbitrage
bank who said,
if the law
we
enforcement
don't have any
officers
problems
are
with
not
crypto
that,
because we haven't regulated
savvy
it.
with that, and they move
And unfortunately, that's the perception that we often come across.
Big budgeting, for
In fact, I
example, we
often
see
give a
lot of that
presentation to
happening,
new
and so romance
investigators, and I put
scams,
up a
across
Bitcoin wallet
different,
address. And I say, you've just found this
joint
piece of
all
paper
over the
in a
world,
search. What is
and
it?
of course, so they put the whole
I would
team
say
together.
the
The
amount
moment
of
it comes
times I've
into
been
West
able to
Africa,
get a
for
successful
example, it
answer
moves
is
to crypto,
probably,
and
and
it
I'm
goes
not
silent.
overestimating
And so
this,
it
one
looks
in
like
100.
it's something that
So we have a long way
is
to
very
go to
difficult
educate
crack. But again,
our
we're working, I
investigators,
think
our
the knowledge is
prosecutors, to
popping
understand
up.
what it is they need to be looking
So
for.
we're doing that education across
So they're really my key
different law
takeaways.
enforcement agencies.
The
So
only
in
other things I
Nigeria, for
want to
example,
say
we've been training the law
is
enforcement across 25 days with
audaciously,
different
we at
eyes,
Basel are
and
currently
also not look at it as
advertising for
cybercrime issues.
cryptocurrency
you see,
investigation specialists, and you
the
haven't
officers in
applied and
charge
you'd
will
like
tell
to,
you, oh, it's
please
crypto,
do so as soon as
naturally
possible because the
cybercrime.
closing date is
So
soon looming,
others don't
and then
actually
you will be the
want
one
to
standing
do
here next year
anything
instead of
about
me.
that to people in human trafficking.
And then,
They
of
tell
course,
them,
we're
oh, it's
always
not
looking
us, it's
for next
cybercrime.
year's conference
So
if
what
any
the
country
criminals
or
are
any
now
entity would be really keen to
continually
host it,
increasing
and we'd be keen to have a discussion
those aspects.
about
So I
what that
think
might look like.
one thing that I see also is that
Now,
organizational
I can hear in the
synergy,
distance the opening of beer
that is a
bottles
very
and
big
pulling out
problem.
corks
So
from
each
wine
and every
bottles.
organization is
And to
actually
me, that's a signal to
investigating
shut up.
in silos, so no communication.
So once again, I'd like to thank
So
all of
that,
you, and in
to me,
particular
is a
Monica, who's
very
been
big
the
challenge.
real orchestrator
So
of today and
maybe-
making it all
maybe the
happen.
discussion
So
can
can we
unravel
please give her
those
and all of us a
parts.
round of applause?
Yeah, thank you so much, Deji. Yeah, it is true. Working in silos, certainly
Thank you and safe
it's
journeys
a
home.
problem. It has been a problem forever. Probably we'll continue to see it as a problem for quite a long time until we'll find a solution, which I don't know what can be. But obviously, that's something that needs to be improved, cooperation between different agencies, but also different, even individuals.
So
within
for
the
that
same
beer and
agency,
wine, we're
sometimes
moving
it's
to the
difficult
Arc
to have
Hotel
cooperation.
from
So
5:30.
moving forward,
Arc Hotel,
obviously, we
5:30.
need to have some kind of solid structure that can be applied by the relevant agencies from the private sector and public sector as well. And Ronnie, we heard Philippines being mentioned by Tarana before as well. It comes out quite often, probably because we have a tech-savvy population, which has facilitated some the provision of some opportunities also to criminal organizations to establish their own activities in the Philippines. So I wonder if you can share a little bit of your point of view on the challenges and opportunities that you see in this space.
Okay, yes, good morning. Just an information, in 2022, our law enforcement units raided so many offshore gaming operators in the country, and we found out during our investigation that most of these companies are actually involved in scams, various scamming activities. And in the course of our further investigation, victims are actually being forced to do criminal activities. These victims are actually coming from different Southeast Asian countries. They come to the Philippines. They are being lured actually to work and being promised with good salaries, just to end up being forced when they are now in the country. They are being forced to do criminal activities like scamming, all different types of scams, and sexual exploitation is also part of it. Now, we already filed cases against these offshore, these scam centers. And what we filed are actually limited to human trafficking and anti-money laundering. There is really a need for our law enforcement units to improve our investigation in terms of cryptocurrency, because we found out in all these, one of these scam companies actually is that we were able to freeze a crypto asset. And we are still awaiting for the court actually to allow us to examine the content of those freezed asset. And the issue actually is that we cannot just require somebody or experts from other countries to do the examination, because the court will only allow our law enforcement agency to do it. So in short, challenges includes equipping our law enforcement investigators with the training, and we also need our country actually to regulate the use of cryptocurrency through passage of laws. And then what is very important also is cooperation between law enforcement agencies from various countries. Actually, we are doing it in our country right now. And next week, actually, we are having a meeting with all heads of cybercrime units in the Asia Pacific, and it will be held in Manila. And I know some of our friends right now are present this morning, will also be present next week. So see you next week. We really need to improve our investigative capabilities. That is one issue, one challenge that we are looking at.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Yeah, it's true. Giving the proper skills to the investigators, to the relevant agencies is key, obviously, but there is a lot of weight on how the legislation is actually designed in each of the jurisdictions. We see still countries where they find very difficult to recognize crypto or virtual assets as an asset. So it becomes quite difficult for them to associate the value within the virtual asset with the criminal cases. And that obviously is not just a barrier for the country which is concerned, but also for other jurisdictions which might seek for international cooperations from those countries. And having a better approach in terms of legislation is also one of the commitments that we have at the UN. That's why we work with the global community to find a way to standardize this kind of approach. It's not easy, but we are going towards that direction, which brings us to the second topic that I would like to discuss with the panelists. Given the situation with criminal organizations who have been exploiting the several opportunities that they see with the use of cryptocurrencies, obviously they have accumulated quite significant amount of money in virtual assets or cryptocurrencies. We heard that the use of cash couriers by professional money launderers now has been adopted in a way that also cryptocurrencies can provide support to the kind of networks. They've become quite stronger in several jurisdictions. So I wonder whether we can consider if we are too late in addressing these issues. So if we are already behind the curve, or if there is a way that we can actually go ahead, as you just mentioned during the openings this morning as well, to make sure that we have proper responses which are capable of addressing these issues in a proper way. So Tarana, what is your point of view on this situation now? Do you think that we are already behind the curve here?
Well, the shortest question probably will be yes, but I don't think we're that hopeless. So I guess yes, we're behind, but we're not hopeless. So so in that aspect, just also recall on what the panelists also mentioned, when back a few years ago, when we were discussing about how the people are being exploited online, there were a lot of questions whether or not we're confusing it with a cyber crime. So then we were saying that trafficking is not a cyber crime, but it's cyber facilitated crime. But now with the pig butchering case and the fraud and scams, there is a thin line whether or not it's also a cyber crime. So it also brings a discussion into how many disciplines need now to work together to reach that to reach that objectives, that we actually become hopeful that we're actually keeping pace with what criminals are doing. So the first one, of course, is, as we call in the OSCE with the criminal justice, as I've been working a lot with the criminal justice practitioners, that early collaboration. So if there is a suspicion that there is something happening, so it's not like what Adedeji mentioned, working in silos. So this silos needs to be breaking. We need to break that silence, and there is this trustful relationship that needs to be built between different public agencies across the disciplines, but also between the public and private sector. So mostly if we talk about private sector. So when we talk about the cryptos, well, since the virtual assets development, there are also lots of blockchain analytics or forensics applications have been developed. The one of them is Chainalysis, for example. So those are the important tools for the law enforcement to actually use and to work on. And that also, one of our recommendations in all our political reports, as being a political organization, we also call for technically savvy or cyber skilled anti-trafficking law enforcement agencies to be part of the anti-trafficking police squads, or to work together with a cybercrime specialist if they see a cyber element in the crime, whether it's about CSAMs per se, or if it's about any other forms of exploitation that includes a cyber element with a payment, just like a digital currencies. This is also brings an issue in terms of how we understand the victimhood, in the sense, as an OSCE, we call for the trafficking cases, first of all, understanding who are the victims, because in many of these cases, what the colleague from the Philippines mentioned, and the forced scams especially, you will see the same person as the perpetrator and the victim, and that's true because they have committed an offense, but whether or not the consensual perpetration an offense, that should be questioned. And I think it's one of the most important is that because trafficking is a victim-centered crime, because there isn't a victim in it, it's important to support those victims so that we can get that enough evidences from them, and they are actually willing to cooperate because they are the biggest holders of the information, how they were recruited, what kind of payment system were used, whether they use themselves the payment systems, whether any of the ATMs machines were used to make those cryptos into the cash, because sometimes they are forced to make those cryptos into the cash. So all of this data needs to be put into record and actually needs to be collaborated as we look at in any investigations of human trafficking cases.
Thank you, Tarana and Scott, from your perspective.
I'm going to sit on the fence and say yes and no. No, in the sense that if we start talking about the traditional sense of cryptocurrency investigations undertaken by those kind of experts within cybercrime teams and organizations, and certainly demonstrated by Emma from TRM earlier with that huge complex kind of ransomware group emanating out, linked to the DPRK, and the ability to have wholesale investigations to a conclusion there with some of the most complex investigations. The work carried out by EC3 and other kind of high-level performers throughout the European Union looking into cybercrime investigations, then you would say no. I'd say we're on par with those criminal organizations who are doing that. We often have great success. When I say, yeah, we are behind the curve, it's going to be in other areas of policing, other areas of law enforcement, other areas of government agencies, for the reasons we've already articulated. Because often what will be the case if a cryptocurrency investigation or a link to cryptocurrency in a kind of traditional drug trafficking organization investigation comes across the desk, we'll concentrate on seizing the drugs, seizing the firearms, looking at the victims of migrant smuggling. We forget about that cryptocurrency address. It's left, it's parked. There's valuable intelligence when nothing is done with it. It's not collated, it's not pooled, it's not looked at. So we're missing vital opportunities for that wider kind of global network. We all know, certainly from speaking for the team here today, that cryptocurrency transcends jurisdictions and boundaries very easily. And often my thought process, certainly now I've left the police, is the value of that one cryptocurrency address, be that a Bitcoin, be that USDT, whatever it is, can in fact be more valuable than the siege of the 200 kilograms of drugs, but it gets left on the cutting room floor. So that's where we're behind the curve. It's an understanding of the value a cryptocurrency address or supportive investigation can actually bring to wider strategic objectives. So yes and no. So sorry for sitting on the fence.
Thanks. Very balanced answer. And yeah, I have the feeling that it's not really much different from when we were dealing with fiat currencies or other assets. Yeah, where usually the usual approach has been focusing on the drugs in case of drugs or saving obviously victims from human trafficking, and a bit less of investment for doing proper financial investigations, going after the finances of the organizations. I would like to quote Paul again. I don't know where he's sitting now, but he mentioned earlier that ransomware is like a business where there were ransomware attackers who were only working during working days and not during the weekends. And it's the same kind of approach applies to organizations, criminal organizations, who they have a focus which is on generating profit and having access to their profit. And obviously, they build their own existence on the financial structure that they can manage to establish. And without that financial structures, obviously, they would collapse as a business. And so thank you very much. And Deji, how about you? Are you more optimistic or more on a balanced approach?
I think I go with Scott. Yes or no? I think the criminals, like I did mention earlier, are more cooperative and they are updating their knowledge. There are a few of them that I follow on Telegram, for example. It is a new tool today. You see a bunch of them gather a lot of people because it's becoming very structured, like Paul mentioned. Very structured. As a matter of fact, in West Africa is a school that you get enrolled in. That way you're taught how to do these stuffs. And again, that will be maybe because of lack of employment, for example, and they are university graduates, and so they easily recruit them into that. And so you see them updating with latest technology, latest tools, and that does not the same for law enforcement, for example. It takes a lot of time for you to be able to even get that single training based on my discussions with them. Some of them go outside, the training calendar to actually, train themselves, but they are not deployed to those departments to actually handle those stuff. So in that case, I would say we're somehow behind the curve in that stance. But again, based on sharing of knowledge and of course the interaction from different law enforcement, which again, we all alluded to that fact that it's not enough. We should do more. And that is the same thing I just finished discussing in Nairobi with 21 countries for anti-money laundering group or within 21 Eastern and Southern Africa, where I just came to this place from there. And there's this argument there. So we're having this public sector, private sector collaboration like we're having here. But we asked, can the private sector please step out? We want to, so they said, you were talking collaboration here, but you said lock up the door so we can. So we have to break the barriers genuinely, to actually share a lot of information. And I think there's a lot of value, those collaboration can actually bring. And I give you an example. One of the oldest bank in Nigeria, for example, I'm currently sitting and helping out with 2 investigations, and those are bigger banks, one in West Africa and one in Nairobi. And all of these are criminal activities from different crimes that eventually will land in those banks and then mix with some criminalities within those banks to get that out. And so a lot of things we're getting without collaboration, we cannot be able to break this cycle, to actually get it through. So maybe with more collaboration, I would say we're possibly not behind the curve, but if we continue that way, that's why I take the stance of yes and no, and we possibly will get it. So, for example, one of the cases that I told you with those banks, they were investigating and trying to get some intel, which they were not able to. And when they reached out to say, hey, Deji, I think if it's something you can help with it. And so I traveled to the UK where I think there was a link and I sat down with a guy. So freely I could talk because I'm not law enforcement. So they were very open. So I got all the touch points to different banks, HSBC, Lloyd banks and all that. And so we could put that together and then feed the Interpol with that. So for me, it's just for the love of doing this to make sure we break the ranks. And so that is why it's not a job for one particular sector. And I think we should collaborate more.
So thanks again. So collaboration is clearly the key here. And good point on the difficulties in having proper public-private partnerships working smoothly. Sometimes it's difficult to have open discussions. Again, there are barriers which are coming from legislation. Sometimes it's not just possible to discuss in detail about cases, and that's why probably you see situation with closed doors. It's happening tomorrow as well, unfortunately. But there are some limits and that have to be maintained. We heard this also from previous discussions as well, and it's right. It's correct. Sometimes you have investigations which are involving suspects not necessarily being actually guilty of any criminal offenses, and it's correct to maintain some distance and possible protection on that. But obviously, the cooperation needs to be improved. I can bring you an example for the region I work on, Southeast Asia. We brought recently together the countries over there with the public sector and the private sector. We discussed the model from the United Kingdom, which is a good model, has been there for probably a decade now. Yeah, most likely, yeah. So obviously with many challenges and things, but has been there. We looked at the Australian model as well, which is also a good model for our counterparts in the region for the context that we see there for what's happening in terms of criminal organization, also using cryptocurrencies. And which brings me back to the Philippines again, to Ronnie. What is your opinion on, are we too late in addressing these issues?
We may be behind the curve, but with our continuous cooperation, I am still optimistic that we can still beat the cyber criminals. Very optimistic.
Thank you very much. And I would like to use your time a little bit longer today, because I know that in the Philippines, you are building very good, I would say, knowledge and best practices, because you are addressing now criminal organizations, serious forms of criminal organizations in the country, which link to human trafficking as well, and the challenges of recognizing and protecting the victims of human trafficking when they're forced to perpetrate crimes. In the Philippines, there are big numbers of scam centers. We are talking about big numbers, and each of these scam centers are hosting some hundreds of victims of human trafficking. So can you imagine how challenging that can be for a single jurisdiction or a country to deal with police operations when you have to address these scam centers and you have to deal with hundreds of people every time. And you have to maintain them and feed them and recognize who are victims, who are perpetrators. So it's not easy. It's a little bit similar to the human trafficking and smuggling of migrants that you see in Europe coming from the Middle East or from Northern Africa. It's the same situation. So you need support and political will in order to really succeed in this. How did you see any recent change in the Philippines on how you're approaching these issues of the scam centers?
One issue actually is how do we handle the traffic victims? Okay, and there is now an ongoing interagency cooperation being conducted locally, and because we are only part of the law enforcement, and if you talk about raiding scam centers, and if you are going to recover hundreds of, the last time there were thousands of actually traffic victims, and you have to feed them, you have to provide them with good shelters. And there was one time that most of these Chinese victims actually do not want to go home. So what we did was we forced them using government funds actually, because there are also other countries who cannot support the funding of their own citizens. So that is actually one big issue that we also need to consider.
And thank you. I would like to go back to Scott on this as well, because I do have a feeling, I don't know if you share, but also the other panelists here, I do have a feeling that there are more opportunities in investigating cryptocurrencies compared to cash. So there is a little bit more visibility, and tracing the transaction is a bit easier, obviously with the need of support from the private sector. And do you think that early approaches in identifying where this asset value is might be an opportunity for government agencies to get hands on asset that can be invested later on for supporting this kind of situations where they have to actually take care of victims of human trafficking in big numbers?
Yeah, 100%, Fabrizio, and I'd articulate that. First and foremost, I'm not that clever. I've never worked in the cybercrime environment. However, the benefits provided by blockchain, because it's on a public open ledger, as long as we know how to exploit that, we can work both reactively, but more importantly, we can work proactively to kind of flatten out that curve we've talked about here. We can start to identify those kind of major users of illicit cryptocurrency linked to off-chain criminality, the type we're discussing here. So yeah, it does provide a valuable intelligence asset. It's not just to wait reactively and address comes across your desk to conduct that investigation. Cash is still king, 100%. And again, I'm still surprised that we start looking at those major organized crime groups operating globally. I would not touch cryptocurrency due to the vulnerabilities associated with it. And I think we've seen from some of the presentations already, even those kind of hardened cyber criminals or kind of state actors who are utilizing cryptocurrency, yes, they're more complex investigations with specialist support required to bring about a conclusion, but we can, in the main, bring about a conclusion, I would suggest. So it's really interesting. And, I look at it as the blockchain as soon as you set foot on that, in a kind of old money or old language, it's fingerprints into the DNA of that organized crime group who've now actually put themselves above the parapet. They're on the blockchain. So for things like that, it does provide certainly investigation or intelligence opportunities to bring about other seizures, asset recovery. And then we'll hear about that this afternoon, how we can facilitate that. And again, those funds being recovered can be used to support those other initiatives, certainly as we discussed there, put into those rehousing of migrants or those victims of kind of scams and other things like that. So the whole host of different ways we can look at blockchain intelligence. I don't like the term data. We say data, we automatically scare ourselves. I think that's something complex. It's not complex. It is a viable and valuable intelligence asset to support any form of investigation. What I would say, and what I've been subjected to and seen globally, crypto is in every aspect of an investigation now, street level drug dealing, all the way up to the kind of transnational drug organizations. Crypto is there, but cash is still king. And what I would say is blockchain intelligence just replicates real world life. If you know that there's kind of known drug trafficking routes or global illicit financial flows in the traditional financial sense, they will be replicated in cryptocurrency. The beauty of that is we can identify, we can track, we can trace them, we can identify those endpoints to have some kind of seizure opportunities.
Thanks so much, Scott. And I have a question also for Deji regarding Africa. We see that, we know that criminal organizations are quite flexible. They tend to adapt to any context and situation. With now Asia having a stronger approach against scam centers, we see that there are some indications with the same criminal organization establishing similar structures in Africa. So do you think that you're going to deal in Africa with situations like in Southeast Asia and East Asia, where you have foreigners being smuggled or trafficked for forced criminality, or you think it's going to be more local population that will be forced to work into these scam centers?
I think we have enough locals. So yeah, I think it's more localized, and a lot of those activities are local, and I think they're highly sophisticated in my view, with what they do. The only aspect that I'm thinking of is actually they understand, like Scott mentioned, that if you touch crypto, for example, you're easily traceable. And so the myth before that, okay, it's money for criminals, it's not traceable, you can investigate it. I think it's becoming very clear with the likes of Chainalysis and all the analytic companies that if you touch it, you're going to be in soup. So they know it. I think so they gravitate towards cash. The only advantage that I think they are seeing recently is the cross-border nature and the complexity in actually getting those monies back. And I can tell you for free, that has been the frustrating part in investigating cryptocurrency. As open as it is for you to use the analytic tools to trace it down. And so what happens? What next after you do that? Yesterday, immediately I checked into the hotel, I received one of the message from a chap from Interpol that I'm working with on a very serious case. And the exchange, of course, we've been able to trace it down to where this monies are. But the exchange wrote back to say, hey, we can give you the information. Yeah, we saw, I think it's accurate. The things you sent, and actually the blockhead and all those details are actually right. But we can't send this information to you even though the access to get court order, which we did with the Interpol, and of course use the normal channel that the exchange have, designated for law enforcement, SOFINA and all that, but they just refuse, and they say you have to use specific court within the British Virgin Island, and then that whole information have to come from there. And so it's just complex because, this word is don't wait. So I still get back to cooperation, so it's very critical. So at the end, you have a lot of cases you've been able to crack because it's simple to trace them on those analytic tools. But then what next? Internationally, there's a lot of arbitrage. Different countries don't regulate them the same. So criminals also are good at studying where they can get this regulatory arbitrage, and they go to those places. And so it's somehow very complex for you to get to the end of it. And so to answer your question, if maybe proceeds can be used to finance this part, is how do you even get the recovery? And there's a lot of challenge, like I mentioned, with knowledge, for example. So we've been able to go around different law enforcement agencies in partnership with Chainalysis within Africa. Our firm happens to be the first investigative partner Chainalysis in Africa. So we'll go around the regulators, law enforcement, we do those trainings together with them. And now they're able to now confiscate, and then you don't have a framework to actually custody this confiscated asset. So there's a lot of challenges that I know in discussions like this we'll be able to surmount with the coming years.
Sure. Just coming there, Ali made a really interesting point that organised crime groups will target those areas of vulnerability, i.e. those jurisdictions where there may not be the kind of required regulation policies put in place, which allows them to kind of operate more freely. And I just did some interesting analysis, some colleagues who are far more clever than myself, and we looked at some of the FATF grey list countries, and then we compared that to their kind of cryptocurrency adoption and how that's changed since they've actually fallen off or got onto the grey list or the blacklist, and we see that increase in adoption. So what is the driving force behind that? I'm not sure. Yes, that's just a hypothesis. It could be criminally derived funds, but it's interesting to see that kind of assimilation there. So good point made by Adi.
Yeah, with the FATF listing, obviously that it's an indication of deficiencies in the country, the jurisdictions. It can be kind of expected that criminal organization will exploit those jurisdictions. And the FATF, they also have a contact group on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers to monitor how the situation is going on within all the jurisdictions which are member of FATF, but also the regional state bodies. So there is a kind of attempt to take a little bit of overview. And just the last question before we go with the slide of questions for Tarana. Do you think that for this kind of scenario, for human trafficking, for forced criminality, do you think there is a need for establishing best practices, ad hoc best practices? Or maybe you can make use of the knowledge that has been established so far in addressing the issues of human trafficking in other sectors as well?
While I was the panels were speaking, I just realized that I should make this comment also. Particularly when we talked about the forced scams and the scam centers, we call it the exploitation and criminal activities, because often there could be also children. The force element is not valid in the case of children, so the means are irrelevant. So particularly on the fraud and scams, I think we need to understand that those risk jurisdictions have proliferated. So it's no longer just the global south. And it's not just the Laos, Myanmar, Philippines. Just last year when I was in Turkey, we were doing an event on national action plan. So just on that day, on that week, they reached the conviction of a number of perpetrators who trafficked Thai, I think it was Taiwanese, 10 Taiwanese and they were locked in Antalya to fraud and scam others. So similar scam centers were also found in Georgia and Montenegro. So it's no longer out there, it's actually right here. It's actually in the borders. So I think when we discuss a risk to jurisdiction, I think we have to be a bit more flexibility of who we understand as a risk. That's one. As it relates to also following the crypto traces, when we look at the cases on CSAMs, As I said, the Internet Watch Foundation, when they looked at all these websites that actually depict child sexual abuse materials, they actually classified into two. It's commercialized and non-commercialized. So the commercialized portion was actually 11%. So that means that's where they could see the payment types offered. Non-commercialized is the rest of the piece. So non-commercialized means that there is also an intention for not for the material benefit, but for gratification. So which is also another the scary part of the crime. So so that also brings into issues that when we look at in one form of exploitation, we have to understand that usually, as we call in the OSCE, we had one of the speakers, I think it was from the Justice Mission last year in the conference, who mentioned one thing and actually stuck with me, that most often the traffickers are opportunistic criminals. So they wouldn't go into the hassle of they're going into the dark webs and cryptos. They actually could actually do it quite openly. So, and they can be deterred if they're actually, if their money or their pocket has been actually hit hard. So that means we never looked at, for example, sexual exploitation in pornographic sites. We never look at the sexual exploitations that is held online to see what kind of payment types actually being used. Because often in the cases when the CSAMs are used, it's often that the offender is likely to also watch the adult sex. So it's actually the same kind of financial trace can be traced in both forms. So my point would be that by looking at the financial flows, whether it's crypto related or any different types of payments, not to stick with one form of exploitation, but actually look at to see whether or not the individual addresses actually is flashes in anywhere in the social media websites that is related to adult websites or any other forms of exploitations or any other the red light districts, because it's often that the criminals are actually offended on different types of crimes rather than one. So that would be one. And just one good example I want to say, as we work on crypto size with Tether, one of the good examples, and I wanted to mention about the Tether just froze 225 million, as far as I know, on the peak butchering case through this smart contracts, which is a good way of how it's been the crypto assets issuers can actually use. There's also another version of that. They can delete and burn the withdrawals from the cryptos, which can then be served to the victims as a compensation, which has been done in the peak butchering case. So I think it's a good example that can be seen for other crypto assets providers to look at those type of applications that could actually look at those kind of smart contracts.
Thanks so much, Tarana. I don't know, do we still have time for questions from Slido?
Okay, so I think I can see one, and somehow I skipped it. It's becoming very massive, and that is using cryptocurrency to actually traffic for wildlife and timber. And Asian guys are doing that massively, currently just getting all that and repatriating using P2P exchanges to actually do through our wallet system. And of course, they just get it down in China or wherever those have to be. Is a very big challenge. And I think we see that trend rising very massively. As a matter of fact, the trend was also generally noticed in Nigeria, for example, where there's a massive flow and they are ready for the P2P, they are ready to actually exchange the local currency at any rate for a USDT, so they can quickly just move it out. And so based on the trend, that went very massive to the extent that it affected the currency side because everybody was ready to just dump it for the ready buyers for timber dealers and illegal wildlife trafficking. So yeah, it's very, very obvious.
I would just say on the illicit wildlife, it is a growing industry. And as we say, we know cryptocurrency is huge in some of those countries we've just discussed there, certainly USDT. So we partner with the United for Wildlife, and we're coming into those public-private partnerships where we are now seeing the emergence and the growth for cryptocurrency to support that type of criminal activity. So it is a very poignant and certainly is on the increase.